session, because I have started the recording so that all students know exactly, why something is happening in a particular way. So how this is going to be structured is I'm going to start off with a bit of preaching, and then we're going to move over to CGT, and then after CGT I'll have a look at VAT, and then of course next week's Collaborate session on Tuesday will focus solely on VAT, and particularly the study pack that you are busy with now, Learning Unit 1, which is the basics of VAT. Right. So I received a WhatsApp, and I don't know if the student is in the session, and I'm really not trying to pick on him or her, but I thought, if one student is wondering about this, then I'm sure that a lot of other students are worrying about it. And the query related to the fact that, there's a long weekend now from the university's perspective. So the UFS, Thursday and Friday are part of this long weekend, which means that there can't be any academic activities or assessment activities scheduled on those 2 days or over the weekend. And this question, or the student is concerned because the volume of work is still the same. So, I gave you a study pack at the beginning of the week, and it's not necessarily less than what you would have received in any other week. So I just wanted to address that so that you can get a sense of, where I am as lecturer, and where you are, or hopefully will be or should be as students. And I need to put in the disclaimer that, this year is weird. I mean, this is not a regular year for any of us. In an ideal world, without any COVID, we would have had an April recess, we would have had a June-July recess, we would have had a September-October recess, but we don't have that, right? What we have is an academic year that we need to get to, or need to get through, because there's a large volume of students in this class that needs to graduate, right? They want to graduate and start working, they want to graduate and go on to postgrad, and the other part of the student group needs to go on to third year. So we need to get through the year, right? The university has now given us the long weekends, and I try really hard to, not just for you as students, but for myself, to make sure that I can actually use those long weekends. But unfortunately, the reality is that I cannot make the work less because we have a long weekend. What I can do is I can, try to limit the assessment activities. So you will see, for example, there's no assessment activity this week. Yes, there's one for next week, but, it's Thursday, Friday. So if I think about the work that needs to be covered in, and I'm taking ETXN specifically because it's my module. ETXN is a 32 credit module, which means that, as part of working out your academic program and progress, and for degree purposes, this module contributes 32 credits towards your overall degree. Linked to that is a concept known as notional learning hours. Now, this concept is defined within the South African Qualifications Framework document, and it says it's the estimated learning time taken by, and I copied and pasted this, I'll put in the reference because, this was done very quickly before the session. It's the estimated learning time taken by the average student to achieve the specified learning outcomes of the course unit or program. So, the learning outcomes for ETXN 2708. And it's not a precise measure, but it provides students with an indication of the amount of study and the degree of commitment expected. So for a 32 credit module like ETXN, you will, or the average student, because some students need less time, some students need more time. That depends on each student. But you are 320 hours over the course of the academic year. And if we work on 13 weeks per semester, That means on average for a 32 credit module, you should be spending 12 hours per week. Now, that 12 hours per week includes your assessment activities. So in some weeks you might be, spending on the dot 12 hours. Other weeks you might be spending less. But the reality is that that is the minimum amount of time that you should be spending on your, in this case, ETXN 2708. So what am I saying? I am saying that our reality is we have to get through the content, right? Even though we're a continuous assessment module now, there are still assessment activities that you need to be able to complete. There are still selection requirements that have to be met towards the end of the year. And there is no way, we've cut as much as we can. The past week, and you'll only see this when you get the next study pack. But again, I put in a request with my colleagues on third year and PG DIP level to leave out work for them to cover on third year, because I think the volume is going to be too much. So I'm cutting as much as I can. It is your responsibility as student to manage your learning time so that if there is a long weekend and you want to take it off, right? So that you space your learning so that everything happens before the long weekend and you don't have to do anything over the long weekend. Unfortunately, I cannot manage that for you. And you will see that in the VAT study packs. I give recommendations, right? So my recommendation, for example, for this week is 8 hours, right? Spend 8 hours this week on the basics of that. If you do that, then you won't have to do anything for tax over the weekend. And you will also, if you do it properly, be ready for the online quiz, the low stakes quiz that is up next week on VAT. But you have to manage that as a student. I really can't make the work less as much as I want to. Our reality for 2020 is it sucks, right? You might have to put in a bit more work than you normally would have, because I'm definitely putting in a lot more work than I would have in normal circumstances. And I think we have to really be considerate of each other. So I really try to, and that's why sometimes these study packs might seem like they are huge. They're not really. It's just me, instead of being able to talk to you face to face, having to write down what I would have wanted to say. So I really want to encourage you to, and I'm really glad that the student reached out to me, because I mean, if this concerns you and you just keep it to yourself or you share it with your friends, then it just stays there. But at least now we can, well, I say we, but I can talk to you about it. But you are more than welcome to engage with me on this, and I'll explain to you exactly why you need to take control of your studies. You are on an NQF level 7, and I indicated it at the beginning of the year, and I've indicated it in your study guide, but you are responsible for the management of your learning, and you have to take accountability. So you have to be the one that manages your learning time in such a way that if there is a long weekend, you don't have to worry about the work, right? So that's what I'm doing. For example, I want to take this long weekend and do nothing. I won't be able to, because there is work that I have to do, but I want to work as little as possible over the weekend. So for the past couple of weeks, I've been starting at 5 o'clock every morning, and I sometimes go until 9 o'clock at night. But that is my way of managing my work so that this weekend I can do as little as possible. And really, I don't give you those hours to make you, go like, oh, she's working so hard. I chose this career. I wanted this. I do this, and I do it because I enjoy it and because I love tax, and I love learning and teaching. But you have to take ownership of your learning. If you are struggling to do that, so you are struggling with time management and how to structure it, again, reach out and get in touch with me, and then we can make a plan to to help you with that. All right, okay, so the preaching session is now over. I am moving over to capital gains tax. So just again, a reminder, right? Capital gains tax is calculated using the rules in the 8th schedule, right? So we have a set of rules for calculating capital gains and losses, and then taking those gains and losses and ultimately getting to a point where we have either a taxable capital gain that's included in our framework for the calculation of taxable income, or an assessed capital loss that we take forward to the next year of assessment. So even though we use the 8th schedule, separate rules to do the calculation, ultimately, if it's a taxable capital gain, it does hit our framework for the calculation of taxable income. I cannot emphasize enough how important the framework or the format or structure or layout of an answer is. So if you look at the screen at this point, and I mean, this is part of a case study that formed part of the CGT learning material, you will note that there are 2 columns towards the right-hand side of my page. The column on the far right is what I use to indicate the effect on taxable income. The second column is where I do my calculations. And I mean, this should look familiar to you because we used a similar approach when we did capital allowances, for example. If I calculate tax value, I don't bring everything into account in my taxable income column. I do the calculation separately in the first column, and then I only take the effect for the current year into my taxable income column, right? So this format is very, very important. What's also important is that every single amount is identified. In other words, we give it its proper name, and we also make sure that we deal with it separately. So, nothing is bunched all together, or it's just a bunch of random amounts on the page. I can clearly see as the examiner, what is the annual exclusion, for example? It's 40,000 Rand, right? What is the taxable capital gain? And there's the calculation that supports getting to the answer of 14,000 Rand. Now, if you calculate the capital gain or loss, you're essentially busy taking proceeds, which is calculated in terms of the 8th schedule, paragraph 35, and you are deducting from that your base cost, which is calculated in terms of paragraph 20, right? So I just want to take you through what a CGT calculation should look like, right? And I really want you to pay attention. I mean, if you're live in the session now, pay attention. If you are watching this afterwards, pay attention so that you can see how the calculation is supposed to look, so that when you practice this in a home tax question or in an, hopefully you're not practicing it for the first time in a test or an assessment, if you're using a case study to practice, you know exactly what this should look like. So this example is taken from the adapted class question for CGT. And in this particular transaction, a manufacturing asset was sold. And this manufacturing asset was brought new and unused, and it was immediately brought into use in a process of manufacture. And we had to determine the effect on taxable income. Now, the first part of your calculation is going to be determining what the current year's capital allowance is, as well as determining the tax value, and then because this asset has been sold, whether there is a recoupment or a scrapping allowance. Now, again, and if this is unfamiliar to you, I really want to refer you back to Learning Unit 9 of topic 2, so the disposal consequences when you dispose of a depreciable asset, so that you know where to indicate the effect on taxable income. So the current year's capital allowance, for example, is shown in brackets 100,000 Rand for the current year of assessment, but we calculate the tax value and then we compare the selling price to our tax value to determine whether there's a recoupment or not. And then we calculate that recoupment by taking our selling price limited to original cost, and we deduct from that our tax value to calculate a recoupment. Right. So this is the first part of our calculation if we ever have a disposal asset, because remember, if you think about which one is stronger, let's call it the main act or the 8th schedule, some should much rather have a recoupment because that 400,000 Rand goes directly into gross income versus a capital gain, because a capital gain, only a portion of that, 80% to 40%, is ultimately included into taxable income. Right. Then because I have a disposal and you now have done CGT, the next part of the calculation is looking at calculating the capital gain or loss per individual asset. And again, I want to focus your attention on the format, the structure of answer. In the far right-hand corner, right, or column, right? So this over here, I don't know if you can see where my mouse is busy jumping up and down, but the far right column shows the effect on taxable income. A capital gain loss does not hit taxable income until you get to the taxable capital gain part, right? So that's the first thing you have to note. You don't do this calculation as part of your taxable income column. What I also want you to see is every single amount is identified. So I have to calculate proceeds, right? Now, proceeds for CGT is the actual proceeds that was received, so the 525,000 Rand, less any amount that's already been included in gross income. Now, for this particular example, that's 400,000 Rand. But I've separately indicated proceeds less recoupment because it's already included in gross income. And the difference between the two, the 125,000, is my proceeds for CGT purposes. What is base cost? Base cost is calculated in terms of paragraph 20 of the 8th schedule. So it's my acquisition or creation costs of 500,000 Rand, and then all amounts that I was allowed as a deduction on this particular asset. So it will be the capital allowances that I had claimed for the current year, as well as any previous years of assessment. So I reduce that against my acquisition or creation costs to leave me with a base cost of 100,000 Rand. The difference between the two, I clearly identify as a capital gain. But at this point in time, I'm not doing anything with it yet, right? Because I will only start thinking about including it in taxable income if it's a taxable capital gain, right? Let's have a look at another example. It's also taken from the adapted class question. It's the vacant piece of land that was sold to a connected person, right? So what happens here? Again, firstly, I check whether there's any recoupments or any deductions for this particular year of assessment. And remember, land is a non-depreciable asset. There's no capital allowances that will ever be allowed to claim on land. So there's no recoupment or no allowances that I have to think about. So I move over to capital gains. Because this is a disposal to a connected person, I think about my market value in terms of paragraph 38. So instead of using the actual proceeds of 215,000, I use my market value of 600,000. But again, I want you to have a look at the format, the structure. I clearly deal with each amount, right? There's my actual proceeds, but I'm not going to use it. Why? Because I have to use market value in terms of paragraph 38. What is that market value that I'm going to use as proceeds? 600,000 Rand. What is my base cost? It's my acquisition cost of 445,000 Rand. There's no allowances that I could have claimed, so I don't need to reduce it. What am I left with? A capital gain. I just want to stop here and quickly check in. Is everybody clear on what the CGT calculation should look like? And if you are not, do you have any questions or something that you want me to clarify? Okay, so I'm going to take your silence to mean that there are no questions yet, right? So while working through the submissions of the online class test 2, so the CGT class test, I came across quite a few CGT calculations that were absolutely brilliant, right? So there are quite a few students who, understand how this works and what it needs to look like. But I also found quite a bit of students, or a number of students, who still need to do a bit of work. So I've taken some screenshots from some of the attempts that I worked through on Blackboard. And if it's your attempt, don't take it personally. The idea is that people should learn from this, or students should learn from this, right? So what should a CGT calculation not look like? And what I mean by that is that these particular CGT calculations, which I've taken from submission attempts of the online class test, these submissions need work, right? You need to practice using your home tax question. You need to practice using the case studies. You need to practice, because if you use these formats in the high stakes assessment, so test 4, 5, or 6, you are going to lose marks. And this is why these low stakes assessments, so the quizzes, and the medium stakes assessments, the class tests, are so important. It's not about the mark, and I really cannot emphasize that enough. It's not about the mark you get. It's about what you learn from it, because ultimately the highest contributors towards your final mark is going to be the high stakes assessments, right? Those are the ones that count the most. But the more you practice, the better your technique is going to get. But you won't know that you need to practice if you, for example, didn't write the online class test on CGT and you didn't realize that, there's something I need to work on. So I really think that you have to see these low stakes as well as medium stakes assessments as learning opportunities, right? Whatever the mark is, it is what it is. But if you can learn from it and then not repeat that in the high stakes, and I say high stakes to mean the online tests for ETXN 2708 this year, but it is also going to carry forward to your further study years if you're going on to third year or PGDIP, and then ultimately CTA or CIMA, whatever the case may be. So I'm going to run through a few examples of what a CGT calculation should not look like, but then I'm also going to show you some that I think really show that the students are practicing and it's showing in what their attempts look like. Right. So the issue in this particular attempt is the fact that if I look at how this is structured, right, the student separately identified proceeds, less base cost, that is beautiful. The problem is it is taken into a second column. So now the issue is, I don't know whether the student knows that, is that, because you don't see it there, but there was a heading taxable income. So that 950,000 Rand definitely doesn't go into taxable income ever. It only goes into taxable income if it ultimately forms part of your taxable capital gain or loss. So what I want you to see from this is be careful of using columns, right? Particularly if you don't label those columns very clearly to show that, okay, this is not my taxable income column, this is just to show the effect of the calculation. For this particular attempt, CGT, a capital gain or loss, is calculated using the rules of the 8th schedule. Paragraph 20 of the 8th schedule refers to base cost, not cost. Cost is a concept, and I know that sounds so nitty-gritty, but the The issue is we have to use what the legislation tells us to use. And the legislation in terms of the 8th schedule says, you know, when you do a CGT calculation, you have proceeds less base cost, right? The actual identifying the amounts, that's beautiful. The using brackets to indicate base cost, perfect. But you cannot call that cost, okay? Because base cost consists of acquisition and creation costs as well as other possible amounts. Okay. This particular attempt, not necessarily wrong, because I mean the final answer, it works out, but this is difficult to mark, and you have to make sure that you, you know, whether you like it or not, you have to get the examiner on your side. So I would just suggest that instead of writing it like this, where the amounts are, you know, some of them are more towards the left of the page and some of them are more towards the right of the page, draw your columns, and then in your calculation column, so that second column, not the far right one, do your calculations in there. But again, the student brilliantly, all amounts are identified, the use of brackets is there. So the only issue here is just, you know, it needs to be structured a bit more neatly. This one is similar to the first one, where there is a disposal amount. It's not a disposal amount, it's proceeds, right? Base cost is correct, and the difference between proceeds and base cost is your capital gain or loss. Again, this student would not have gotten any marks for this calculation because they take a sum of capital gains into taxable income. CGT does not hit taxable income until you get to calculating a taxable capital gain. In other words, taking your net capital gain and multiplying it by your inclusion rate of either 80 or 40%. The issue here is that the student, if you look at the top there in red, he or she says proceeds less base cost is capital gain or loss, which is great. And I can follow that for that first calculation, the 1750 minus 800. But then they get to the plot of land and, you know, suddenly, let's say this was on another page, you can't assume that your examiner knows what those amounts represent. It is your job as student to clearly show your examiner that I know, listen, proceeds is 900,000 Rand, base cost is 500,000 Rand. And if you do that, you'll get the marks. If I see this and I've got no clear way, and when I say clear, I mean clear way, and I'll show you on the other attempts what I mean with that. To understand exactly what that is, then you are not going to get your marks, even though the amounts may be correct. The same with this one. I mean, what is 1.750 minus 800? I don't know what that is. I don't know what 900 minus 500 is. Okay, so this student in an online test would not have gotten any marks for these calculations, right? The same with this one. So, you know, the calculations are there, the amounts are there, but the amounts are not identified. So you cannot assume that because I'm your lecturer, I will know what this means. Okay. If you are in practice at some point and somebody comes to you, a client or a more junior employee, and you have to explain to them how CGT works and you do this, they will never ask you for your services again. Okay. So rather give too much detail than too little. Right. So those are just some of the ones that I think need some attention, right? So, you know, maybe if you saw yours, again, please don't take it personally. It's about the learning that should take place. These are attempts that I think, you know, really show that these students practice and they have a good grasp of what a CGT calculation should look like. For example, this one, proceeds less base cost. So there's clear identification, and every single amount has a description. So I know exactly what this particular student is busy with. The same with this one. So for example, there at the top, yes, it's a bit, pushed in together, but I can see proceeds less base cost, and there's the calculation that support that. So I'm happy with that. The same if you look at the student's use of columns, right? So in the far right column, that's the effect on taxable income, which is 100% correct because it's only the taxable capital gain that goes in. And then the rest of the calculations, very neatly structured with a description next to each of them. And the same here, even though, columns aren't used, there's very neatly done, and every single amount has a descriptor next to it. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, that is my story on CGT. We will be releasing the CGT marks tomorrow, and then you can kind of have a look. So if you go back to your own attempt and you see, listen, the marker or myself gave you a comment that, listen, check your technique or consult your lecturer, please make sure that you know exactly what it is that you need to pay attention to. Okay, I'm going to quickly check in again with you again on CGT. Anything that is unclear or that you require further clarification on before we go on to VAT? Okay, so I will again take your silence as there are no questions so far. Okay, so let's go on to VAT. Now I'm going to start off. Nayo, could you please explain the moving cost transaction? Nayo, I looked at it in the previous Blackboard Collaborate session. Have you watched that video yet? Okay, so just have a look at the previous Collaborate sessions recording, and if you still have questions afterwards, just get in touch with me so that we can clarify it for you. Okay. Great. So I'm going to start off that by just giving you an overview of what the learning is going to look like in VAT. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail today. You will see that VAT, value added tax, has 4 learning units. Learning unit 1, which is what you are busy with this week, the basics of VAT. And then next week, we will have a look at the different types of VAT supplies in Learning Unit 2. The week after that, we're going to have a look at input VAT in Learning Unit 3 and, when input VAT can be claimed and when it can't be claimed. And then we will stop or we will finish off VAT with Learning Unit 4 by looking at the time and value rules relating to VAT. And then once we're done with VAT, we only have natural persons left, and then we are done for the year. Right, back to VAT. I would hazard a guess that if you speak to either a BAC third year or a PG DIP GA student, maybe even a CTA student, right? They will tell you horror stories about VAT because VAT, unfortunately, has a bit of a reputation, right? It's one of those topics that quite a few or a lot of students, they really don't like because some or other student, I don't even know if it was at our institution or at another institution, but some or other student started the rumor that VAT is difficult. Now, let me be very clear. Anything can be difficult, right? If you don't spend enough time working on it. Okay, if I try to do a cartwheel today, it will be difficult and I will break my neck because it's not something that I'm working on and practicing. It's the same thing for any topic like that. That is difficult if you think it's difficult, firstly, and it is difficult if you don't give it adequate attention, right? You have to think about your content or your topics as your children. You can't not give attention to children and think that they are going to behave and give you, you know, what you want in terms of good behavior or good marks for that matter. So that you need to start that off on the right track, because VAT is such an important topic. Again, you know, whether you students like VAT or not is irrelevant. It is something that we as South Africans are confronted with on a daily basis. I mean, every single time you go into a store to buy, whether it's goods or a chocolate or bread or whatever, you are in some way or form influenced by value-added tax, right? So it's very, very relevant to our day-to-day lives. It's very, very relevant as one of the main revenue streams that government uses to, you know, to fund their operations. And from an academic perspective, you know, it's a brilliant topic because it's either, you know, you can either assess it as a standalone topic or it can be integrated with normal tax, which is where, particularly in your, if you go into BAC 3, PG DIP and CTA, that integration with normal tax becomes vitally important, because that is something that if you go out into practice, you will have to advise your clients on, you know, what are the VAT consequences of a transaction and how does the VAT consequences impact your normal tax consequences. So that is something that is continuously assessed in all study years. You know, if you are planning to do CTA to become to do the ITC and the APC, that is also continuously assessed on that part. All right. So what I'm trying to tell you, my dear students, is that if you start off VAT on the right foot, in other words, because I do the fundamentals of that. I do the basics of that. You know, those learning unit 1 to learning unit 4, those are actually the basics, the fundamentals of that. If you put in the work this year on trying to understand that and, you know, getting it, forming a good basis of trying to understand it, then you are going to reap the benefits at the end of the year with the big online tests, as well as with your further study years, as well as one day in practice. Okay, so make sure that you start that off on the right foot. Work on it, give it the attention that it needs, right? So what we will be working towards in ETXN, so by the end of, it's actually going to be learning unit 3, where you'll be able to do a full, you know, VAT calculation already, but by the end of our VAT learning units, you will be able to calculate VAT payable to / or VAT refundable by / and the VAT calculation is essentially the difference between output VAT, which is also known as output tax, and then deducted from that our input. And you're going to learn all about the different types of supplies for output VAT, so standard rated supplies, zero rated supplies, and exempt supplies. And you will see when you work through the basics of that now, you know, you're going to learn all about the accounting basis, you know, payments versus invoice, and all those types of things. If your output VAT is greater than your input VAT, we have a VAT payable situation. In other words, you know, you owe a certain amount. And if your input VAT is greater than your output VAT, VAT is refundable by / I sent out a notification yesterday, but I just want to make sure that everybody made this change. There was a typo, and thank you to the student that brought it to my attention. There was a typo on slide 9 of the study pack in terms of voluntary registration. So if you are a vendor who can register voluntarily for VAT, but your taxable supplies don't yet exceed 50,000 Rand, so not 500,000 Rand, 50,000 Rand, then registration on the payments basis is automatic. And that is sort of the exception to the normal rule, which is you are automatically registered on the invoice basis unless you apply specifically for payments basis. But I will again chat about this next week during our Collaborate session. Then, how can VAT be assessed? So just so that you get a sense of, how this can be asked, and you'll see in terms of homework questions, and I'm pausing because I'm probably going to murder my sister in the next few minutes because she's making a noise. There she left. Okay, sorry about that, you guys. How that can be assessed, it can be asked, there are 3 different ways in which we can assess that. It can either be asked as a VAT journal, and I will take you through VAT journals in detail once we get to Learning Unit 3, which is Input VAT. I'll correct that. Because you get 2 types of VAT journals. We either get correct journals, in other words, it's the first time the transaction has to be processed, so we have to do the journal entry, or we have what is known as correcting journals. In other words, somebody has already processed the transaction, but there's something wrong with it and we have to fix it. But I'm going to give you detailed guidance on VAT journals. Just a comment so long on that. A journal is a journal, right? There's a debit and a credit. And if you can keep that in mind, you're not going to have an issue with VAT journals. But VAT, of course, can also be asked in the form of a discussion question. So you have to think about IPAC. What is the issue? What will the principles be that I use to, address that issue and then apply it to the information in the question and come to a conclusion? You can have a look at page 152 of your study guide for, that particular example. And then, ladies and gentlemen, it can also be asked in the form of a calculation question. So calculate the VAT payable or refundable. And for calculation, and I will remind you of this constantly throughout topic 3, all the learning units, your format is very, very important. So make sure that you have output VAT and input VAT, deal with the 2 separately, and then come to a final conclusion. If you want to have a look at what the format of a VAT calculation question looks like so long, you can have a look at page 153 of your study guide. And this links back to what I said when I kicked off VAT today. You can find this on page 154 of your study guide. So I really cannot emphasize how important this is. So I'm going to read it to you, which I know is so boring, but listen. It is imperative that students study VAT with the necessary level of detail right from the beginning. And if you are in ETXN 2708, then this is the beginning of that for you, right? So make sure that you approach it now, at this point, with the necessary level of detail and attention and focus. Make summaries in ETXN 2708 that you can use again in your later study years. Because what's going to happen is in your 3rd year, if you BAC 2, and if in PGDIP GA, if BCOMAC 3, they will be adding additional VAT principles and issues. And the same if you go on to CTA. If you are planning to go on to work next year, in other words, you're not planning to study any further, again, the foundation in VAT that you get this year is just going to be supplemented with whatever you encounter in the work environment. So your knowledge base that you form in ETXN 2708 is crucial. I really cannot emphasize that enough. Right, that brings me to the end of the official part of today's Collaborate session. Tanay, I'm going to get to you now. There's a question before you. If there was an assessed capital loss in 2019 and a capital loss again this year, will the capital loss be carried over in 2021 be the sum of 2019 and 2020? And the answer there is yes. Because remember, what you do is you calculate your taxable or your capital gain or loss for each individual asset, right? So then you add all of those together to get a sum of capital gains or a sum of capital losses. If you then have a sum of capital losses, right, and you have a natural person, remember that you first have to reduce it with your annual exclusion. In the case of a company, we don't do any reductions at that point, because that then brings us to our aggregate capital loss or aggregate capital gain. And that aggregate capital loss, so what you're talking about, if we have a capital loss in this year, that's an aggregate capital loss. We then add that to any assessed capital loss if there was one in the previous year, and the total of the two. So the sum of 2019 and 2020 is then taken to 2021. Okay, so yes, your answer there is right. Danai, do we need to know the different methods used to do CGT calculations, for example, tab or market value? No. Go back and have a look at the CGT study pack. In the beginning of the study pack, there is a bunch of paragraph numbers from the SABA and the SANE. Those methods that you are referring to has to do with pre-valuation date assets. In other words, assets that were acquired before the 1st of October 2001. Now, I agreed with my colleagues in in BAC 3 and PGWGA that for ETXN 2708 this year, we don't look at pre-valuation date assets, right? They will have a look at it next year. So please don't do anything relating to pre-valuation date assets like time apportionment, base cost of tab, market value, or that 20% of proceeds. Okay. Nayo, when we calculate months for the different categories of tax period, particularly for category A and B, does it matter if the month ends on an odd or even number as long as there is a 2-month gap between the periods? Because the month of August tends to throw the counting off. Okay, Nayo, yes, it matters, right? And when we say odd or even, so I just quickly want to share. Let's do that and see if I can do it this way, right? So if you think about a year, let's do this, right? A calendar year. Okay, so there's a calendar year. So if a calendar year has January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. Am I right? 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Right? Okay. You guys will just audit me so to make sure that I'm not lying at this point. Okay. So if I now go and I number these months, January is the first month, Feb is the second month, March is third, April is fourth, May is the 6th month, June is 6, July 7, August 8, September 9, October 10, November is 11, and December is 12, right? So if we talk about odd and even, right, we're talking about these odd and even. So for example, if I look at category A, which is your odd, so it's your 2 months ending on odd. That means it's your 2 months that end January. So it's December, January, because January is 1, that's an odd number. February, March, that's your next one, because March, 3, is the odd number. April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and then December falls with January, right? Because so it's every single time that your month falls as an odd. Nayo, I just quickly want to check in with you. Does that make sense to you? So you're not counting the number of days in the month, right? So I don't know if you guys ever did that. You know, you counted. I remember I learned the days of the month, whether it's 30 or 31, apart from February, by looking at the knuckles on your hands. So if you count, you start January, you start on a knuckle, so that's uneven, so that means there's 31. And then the space in between the knuckles is your even numbered months. That's not what we're talking about here. So we're not talking about months where the number of days is even or odd. We're talking about what is let's call it the ranking order of the month within a calendar year. So for category B, which ends on your even months, that means a category B vendor will be January, February. Why February? Because it's the second month. It's an even number. The same with March, April, because April is the fourth month. May, June, June is the sixth month. July, August. So even though August has got 31 days, it is the eighth month of the year, which means it's going to be a category B. A vendor that's there is going to be a category B vendor. Okay. Nao, I just want to, again, sorry, I'm picking on you, but happy with that answer. Does it make sense? You're comfortable? Great. Okay. Anything else that you are wondering about or anything? VAT, CGT, we have a few minutes to spare. Okay, Nao, you will then go and also have a look at the previous Collaborate sessions recording so that you can have a look at that moving costs. Again, I want to remind you guys that the moving costs example in the adapted class question is really the most difficult that it's going to get. And I am really not trying to trick you in that sense. So the principle is really important there. Right, and then I think we are going to conclude today's session. I hope you guys have a wonderful day further. And if there are any questions, remember, you can send them through. We will just be taking some time off starting Thursday. I'm going to go pick up my children. I sent them away for a bit, so we're going to fetch them. So if you're traveling, travel safely. If you are, spending time with family and friends, make sure that you appreciate that. And as always, look after yourselves and stay safe.